Welcome back to Critter Corner. This month we have a question submitted by one of our viewers in regards to whether or not shock collars used either over the counter or in certain businesses are safe for your pet. First, to understand what a shock collar is intended to do, let's talk briefly about reward and punishment. When we are training, whether it's a person, a dog, a cat, we are talking about rewards is usually the most common way to get your pet to do something you want them to do. That's really called positive reinforcement. Every time you do something right, you get a reward. It's the most effective way to teach something to an animal or person. But there is also something called negative reinforcement. Negative reinforcement is when something happens in response to something that you do, but you want to avoid that response. You want to avoid what comes after it. So an example might be when you drag your feet on the carpet in wintertime and you get a static shock when you touch your light post, and that hurts. We might pick our feet up when we walk or tap something without actually putting our finger to get that shock. So that's an idea or an example of what negative reinforcement is. It's not so far different from punishment. Punishment is when you do something and something bad happens to you, but you know it's coming. And punishment is not effective at all. It doesn't really deter the behavior. We learn to tolerate the punishment. And so negative reinforcement can actually, when it's not used appropriately, come off as punishment. And when it ends up coming off in punishment, then you're overusing that negative reinforcement, and that's detrimental to that learning curve. And this is where shock collars come in. A shock collar is that static shock. It is that I don't want to do that because every time I do that, I get a shock. If it's done appropriately, it's highly effective. When it's not done appropriately, it starts to become a punishment, and then it does detract from the learning curve, but it also may become cruel to the animal. When we use shock collars, I highly recommend you use it with a company who works well. So here's an example. The Canine Fence Company or Invisible Fence Company. Their job is to come out and install a wire in your yard, and that wire transmits a signal to the collar, so when the dog or cat gets too close to that wire, it triggers that shock. But they don't just give you the wire and the collar and send you off into the sunset. It comes with training sessions. So a trainer comes to your house, they teach you and your animal how to respect that boundary and reward them for doing a good job when they avoid the boundary. So they're also interspersing that positive reinforcement. Another type of shock collar is one that is actually radio operated. You use a device like a remote control. So when the animal's not listening to you, you give them a warning beep and then a shock. That one I'm a little bit more worried about unless you work with a trainer or a company that teaches you how to use the collar. And actually over time, the dog just needs to hear the beep and the shock never happens. So usually the shock is only needed for maybe the first couple of weeks of training when it's used effectively. So I'm not so put off by shock collars when they are used appropriately, but when they're not, then we have problems. Another device that I find can be overused is something called a pinch collar or a choke collar. These are chain collars on dogs that are used to give a correction, but many people put it on their dog and let their dog just pull so that this chain is choking them without actually realizing you're supposed to give a tug and release the collar so the dog gets that correction in the moment. As a matter of fact, most trainers these days have moved completely away from a pinch collar and a choke collar. This is just coming up because I had a client in recently who had a trainer that taught them on a pinch collar, and I was a little surprised. Great alternatives to pinch collars. There is a company that provides something called the Easy Walk Harness, and the other product is called a Gentle Leader, which is a head collar. I love both of these products because they control your dog's behavior, and usually these collars are used when you're out on a walk. If you're out on a walk with your dog and your dog is pulling, the pinch collar is supposed to give them that correction to stay. But a lot of dogs are just so excited, they don't listen to that correction. So the Easy Walk harness looks like a regular harness, but it does have a band that goes across the dog's shoulders just below the shoulder joint. What that does is it doesn't let them extend their arm to get that pull. But the other nice thing about it is it clips right on the chest. So why is that important? When your dog is pulling ahead of you, they're thinking about what's ahead. They're not listening to you because this is far too more exciting. With the Easy Walk harness, that buckle here will literally turn their body towards you as they try to pull, which forces them to pay attention to you. And then your normal training kicks in, where you talk to your dog, you get them to relax, you get them to sit, you get them to stay, without pulling on their neck. The head collar I use for dogs that are a lot more exuberant, where they aren't listening to the Easy Walk harness. The difference is that it buckles under here. And there's a little band over the nose. And those a lot of times are trickier, harder to use, so talk to your veterinarian about using those. We welcome any questions or topics from our viewing audience, so if you have an idea for a future episode of Critter Corner, please let us know.